structures is the patella, the kneecap, a bone that forms within a tendon, within the quadriceps tendon. The quadriceps tendon we'll see today is the point where the quadriceps attach, or through which the quadriceps attach to the tibia, the knee extensors. And the patella is inside the quadriceps tendon. It becomes the patellar tendon after the patella, more distal to the patella. And I think you should have seen a video in lab about the leverage effect of the patella, how it helps to make sure that the tendon and the muscles don't rupture or snap when trying to extend the knee. This is the third joint of the knee, the third sliding joint in the knee. There are two articular surfaces between the condyles of the femur and the tibia, and a third articulating surface between the posterior aspect of the patella and the patellar groove of the femurs. So there are three articular surfaces in the knee joint proper, even though we don't often talk about this one commonly. It's not weight-bearing. It's more to help make sure that the force of the knee extensors is exerted at the proper angle on the tibia. So I've said tibia a couple times. Let's talk about the bones of the lower limb quickly before diving into the knee joint. Tibia is the weight-bearing bone of the lower limb, or of the lower leg, rather. The larger bone that's more medial of the two, fibula, is lateral. That's the common mnemonic to help remember the order of the two bones. The lower leg has the tibia and the fibula. The tibia's proximal end articulates with the femur, like we've seen, and we'll dive into this structure, the point of articulation, shortly. And distally, this is not a big focus of the course this time because we don't have time to go into the detail of the feet, or the hands for that matter, from last section. But articulates with the talus, the large heel bone in the foot. And that's not something you need to remember because we're not going to cover the foot in depth. But you do need to know the point of attachment of the quadriceps through the patellar tendon is at the tibial tuberosity. This raised bump anteromedially on the superior surface of the tibia. So anterior on the front, medial in the middle of, superior at the top of the tibia. This large raised bump, which I've handily pointed out with an animation right there. I will point out before we go too far that I did update the lecture slides online to add a few more really nice pictures. One of them is this picture with the few really important aspects of the knee joint highlighted. And there are a number of nice images for the muscles in different compartments of the leg as we get through those compartments. So those are all updated online to give you a reference for the animations, the videos that I'll show you. So first look and see the quadriceps, the extensors are sectioned right here. This muscle is four different heads of the knee extensors, and they merge at the quadriceps tendon. The patella is in the quadriceps tendon. It becomes the patellar ligament after the patella. What I want to look at are the intrinsic factors of the knee joint that help keep it secure, because it's actually sort of precarious. Having all of your body's weight distributed between two really tenuous columns. The femur sitting squarely on top of the tibia needs to stay squarely on top of the tibia through all of our running, jumping, quick cuts in soccer and hockey. It needs to be secure. And how do we secure the femur on top of the tibia? So these ligaments are not the only ligaments in the tibia. There are a number of different ligaments, as you can see in the example on the right-hand side. There are a number of ligaments that wrap around the knee joint to contain the synovial capsule and the synovial fluid, but we often only discuss the ones on the left. So this video goes into a bit of detail on the structure of the knee joint. You can see the quadriceps tendon that I mentioned before, where the quadriceps converge, and the patellar ligament that connects the patella to the tibia. But the intrinsic ligaments are shown here. So the fibular collateral or the lateral collateral ligament anchoring the knee joint laterally. The tibial collateral or the medial collateral ligament, the MCL, anchoring the knee joint medially. And these are complemented by crisscrossing ligaments that move from the anterior and posterior surfaces across the inside of the knee joint. And they're named for their attachment point on the tibia. So the anterior cruciate ligament, which I zoomed past, attached anteriorly on the tibia. You can see the anterior surface. The ACL dives posterior through the knee joint, but it's named for its attachment point on the tibia. It attaches posteriorly on the femur, anteriorly through the knee joint on the tibia. And the PCL, the posterior cruciate ligament, named for its attachment point on the tibia. If we look down into the knee joint through the femur, you can see the points of contact, the articular surface shown there, and then the two menisci, medial meniscus and lateral meniscus, that act as collars, a lot like the labrum in the shoulder, or the labrum in the hip joint. They secure and center the femur on top of the tibia. And then those themselves are secured across the front to help make sure that they don't slide off to either side by the transverse ligament of the knee. Not an exhaustive list, but these are the important major players for each of their roles. Stopping movement laterally and medially, the fibular and tibial collateral ligaments, and then anterior posterior movement. So the ACL will prevent posterior slippage of the femur relative to the tibia. It will prevent the femur from sliding posterior. And the PCL will prevent the femur from sliding anteriorly off the tibia. So lots of detail on the knee joint, but there's a lot more that we didn't cover. What I want to do for the majority of class is turn away from bones and look at the muscles of the lower leg. And the muscles of the lower leg are loosely grouped in compartments. Anterior compartment, posterior compartment, medial compartment. And I've conveniently picked muscles in these compartments that share innervations. And often, the muscles within a compartment will have a common nerve that innervates them, which helps the memorizing process. Muscles of the anterior compartment typically innervated by the femoral nerve. Muscles in the posterior compartment typically innervated by the tibial nerve, for instance. So if I'm on the posterior side of the leg, my mind immediately jumps to tibial nerve unless there's some exception that we've discussed. But on balance, the major muscles that we're going to talk about in each of these compartments are listed here with their corresponding innervations. This slide will be included in the new set on Moodle, as well as a number of images with these identified. So you'll have all of these muscles identified and pointed out with some key structures of interest that we'll talk about shortly. So flexors, extensors, adductors. anterior, posterior, medial. Flexors are anterior, extensors are posterior, adductors are medial. Now, the muscles that I list are some of the muscles in those compartments, but they all share similar innervations. For instance, all of the hip flexor muscles are innervated by the femoral nerve in this case. At least the hip flexor muscles that we're going to discuss. The hip extensor muscles, innervated by, well, there's only one, innervated by one nerve. The adductors, similar innervation. And then there's a fourth option here, which are just muscles that are kind of interesting. Don't worry about those innervations, okay? Let's take a look at these groupings in turn. So you're going to see a lot of images like this in your slide set. And feel free to follow along. These images list all of the important muscle groups. The individual muscles. Where possible, you can see the innervation. For instance, on this slide, you can see the femoral nerve, but it's difficult to get a good sense of how this travels because there's a lot of musculature blocking the path of the femoral nerve, which is why the majority of our lecture, of our class today, will be relying on these videos to see the path of the nerves, the motions of the muscles at the hip, knee, and in the lower leg. So hip is first. We're focusing on the hip only. Moving the hip. Not moving the knee, but articulating the femur at the hip. Anteriorly, psoas major and the iliacus muscle. They're distinct muscle bellies, but they form one muscle. They merge together and form what's called the iliopsoas muscle. The iliopsoas muscle, a prime hip flexor, innervated by the femoral nerve. Not the only hip flexor. So you have on the list a couple other muscles. You can see here the iliopsoas as it flexes the hip, moving under the inguinal ligament. You can't see that ligament, but it spans across between the pubic symphysis and the iliac crest. You'll see it when the animation stops. Psoas major, iliacus. Also rectus femoris, which is a muscle we'll talk about in more depth later, is a hip flexor because it spans two joints. And then gracilis, no, not gracilis, sartorius, sorry. Gracilis is an adductor. Hold on. Sartorius. Sartorius, a hip flexor, but also the cross your legs muscle. The hip flexion and then lateral rotation muscle because of its orientation. The cross your legs muscle, sartorius. Hip flexor because it spans that joint, but also a lateral rotator as well. So all of these muscles innervated by the femoral nerve. And the femoral nerve branches off of the lower lumbar roots and actually dives or merges between psoas major and iliacus. You can see it pointed out here. This was the inguinal ligament that I mentioned a moment ago. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Just look at the path of the femoral nerve highlighted in blue, innervating all the quadriceps. We'll come back to it again in the next section when we talk about the knee movement. Emerging between psoas major and iliacus, running the length of the extensors, innervating the anterior compartment of the leg. Now, let me just pause it here for a second. Because you will have, notice on this slide, on the right-hand side, you can see the femoral triangle. There's a little dashed triangle that's blown up with a bit of detail. There's some important structures within the femoral triangle, two of which I point out at the end of the video. The femoral triangle is where you can easily identify the femoral nerve, artery, and vein. Femoral nerve, artery, and vein. And the borders of the triangle are the inguinal ligament at the top, sartorius muscle laterally and inferiorly, and then adductor longus, which we don't know about yet, but we'll talk about shortly. And I don't have the vein shown for you here, but if the vein were shown on this image, it would run between the nerve and the artery. The artery we'll come back to later. This large red conduit is the femoral artery. But this triangle is a landmark that you can use to place yourself and easily identify those structures if they're unlabeled. Femoral artery, femoral nerve, femoral vein within the femoral triangle. That's one of two major landmarks that we'll talk about today, or interesting structures, interesting organizations. So hip flexors were those, hip extensors, really only one. I do show you a second muscle in this video, but it's not technically a hip extensor. The main hip extensor, gluteus maximus, one of the largest muscles in the body, if not the largest muscle belly in the body, rivaled only by latissimus dorsi. So gluteus maximus, hip extensor, where you don't have the joint angle easily identifiable. Remember, flexion was the joint angle getting smaller. Extension, is it getting bigger? If you don't have the joint angle easily identifiable, flexion was forward, and the extension was the opposite. Gluteus maximus innervated by the inferior gluteal nerve, which is a branch of this major conduit, the biggest nerve in the body, the sciatic nerve. We'll see that when we get to the fourth option shortly. Being such a large, powerful muscle, it doesn't need another or much other assistance to extend the hip. But I wanted to point out gluteus medius, which is the other more obvious muscle laterally and superiorly to gluteus maximus, as an abductor of the femur. Not an extensor, abductor, raising the femur out into the side. Not part of our grouping. But just for interest's sake. And don't worry about the nerve. It's a similar branch of the sciatic nerve. We care about gluteus maximus, inferior gluteal nerve, or sciatic nerve. They're very close to the same thing. That's the same video. So posterior compartment is easy. Posterior hip flexors are easy. There's one. Anterior hip flexors. There's three that we want to know, all innervated by the femoral nerve. The medial compartment, hip adductors, slightly more complex. Four muscles, all grouped together. I'm going to get rid of sartorius for you. I'm going to get rid of another muscle that we're not going to talk about in depth. And we're going to look at the adductors in a bit more detail. Also, I'll hide the quadriceps so you can see their points of attachment. These adductors, specifically adductor magnus, inserts the length of the line on the back of the femur. So we have adductor longus, adductor brevis. Gracilis is this muscle that I confuse with sartorius. I always confuse those, the long, thin, slender muscles. And magnus is at the back. Magnus, the biggest of the adductors. You can see it fanning inferiorly and on top and behind these muscles. All of these act to adduct the hip, bring the femur back towards the midline. And they're all innervated by the same nerve, the obturator nerve. So you can see adduction, when the muscle's highlighted, it's active. All the muscles of adduction shown here, gracilis, most medially, longus and brevis, and then ignore the one on top. We're not focused on that one today. Now the obturator nerve moves through the obturator foramen, or passes through the obturator foramen, as you might expect. Remember, the obturator foramen was that hole in the pelvis created by the ischium and the pubis. A big open hole that I said was covered. It's covered mostly by a membrane, and that membrane secures or allows attachment of two muscles. So the obturator foramen is in here. And this muscle, whatever it happens to be, attaches the entire surface, or across the entire surface of the obturator foramen, except for one really small opening. And that one really small opening allows passage of the obturator nerve through the pelvis to innervate all of the muscles in the medial compartment. So when you see something like this, this is quite interesting, that a larger hole, a larger opening, is completely blocked off except for one small passageway where only one lonely nerve passes through. The obturator nerve innervating all of the hip adductors. Same one. Nope. So as far as innervation goes, those three nerves are important. This video is just showing you some of the intrinsic muscles of the hip. These are the ones that are really tight. If you have ever dug a finger kind of into your posterior upper pelvis, it's really, really tight and you tend to jump. These intrinsic muscles of the hip are the ones that are often very tight and may or may not impinge on the sciatic nerve. So one of these muscles is obturator internus and obturator externus on the other side, the muscle that covered the entire membrane that blocks the obturator foramen. It loops around the ischium and attaches on the greater trochanter of the femur. Obturator externus is its mirrored counterpart, but outside of the pelvis. So internus inside, externus outside. And you can see if you just look through here, it's attaching in the same location. It just arises from the external compartment. And between all of these muscles, this large conduit, the sciatic nerve, runs down to the lower leg to innervate the muscles of the lower leg. So if these are really tight, it can impinge on the sciatic nerve. Sciatica, numbness, pain in the lower leg, often caused by those muscles being too tight and impinging on the sciatic nerve. Now these intrinsic muscles mostly will externally rotate. They loop around the ischium and attach on the outside lateral surface of the femur, even obturator externus. All of these muscles will externally rotate. So you get a sense when you see the heel come up, external rotation, that crossing your knee motion. So all the internal muscles looping around the posterior aspect to externally rotate. And we're not concerned with their innervations. This is more to reveal some of the intrinsic muscles. Now, as far as the hip goes, that's where we'll end our discussion. But the lower leg is more than the hip, obviously. There's some big players that we haven't talked about yet. And these muscles In the lower leg, articulate the knee. Like with the hip muscles, they are generally grouped, and I'm only looking at the anterior and posterior compartments. The medial compartment in the lower leg, we've already talked about as articulating the hip. These muscles in the anterior and posterior compartments articulate the knee. So they must span the knee joint. Conveniently, all of these muscles share innervation. Anterior is femoral, posterior is tibial. And that's a theme throughout this section. Muscles on the front surface tend to be innervated by the femoral nerve. Muscles on the posterior side tend to be innervated by the tibial nerve. So there's complicated names listed here. You'll more commonly know these groupings as hamstrings posteriorly, quadriceps anteriorly, but there are more specific names that we are interested in. So let's look at flexors. Flexors first? Let's flip it around. We'll do extensors first and flexors second. So extensors, quadriceps, anterior compartment, innervated by the femoral nerve. These are the big muscles. Rectus femoris right in the middle. Vastus lateralis on the outside. Vastus medialis on the inside. Incidentally, we take muscle samples from the vastus lateralis a lot when we do biopsies. You'll see a fun video of that. And then beneath rectus femoris, vastus intermedius. So the three vastus muscles, medialis, intermedius, lateralis, named for their organization, how they're presented in the body. All of these converge at the quadriceps tendon and then act on the tibia through the patellar ligament. They're all conveniently also innervated by the same muscle and do the same action. Extension. No surprises here. Extending the knee, the joint angle gets larger. Don't mind me. Adobe's trying to tell me to update Flash for some reason. Joint angle is getting larger. The muscles are extending. All four heads of the quadriceps, extending the knee joint. You can see the femoral nerve. Remember, it emerges from between psoas major and iliacus way up in the hip, and then dives deep to the extensors, innervating all of the extensors as it heads down through the body. So femoral nerve, highlighted in blue. We can isolate the path a little bit more easily. You can see it travels the length of the extensors to innervate all of those muscles. Right now, the idea of innervating probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we will talk about the neuromuscular junction and how that signal translates from an action potential to contraction in our next section. So quadriceps, three vastuses and a rectus femoris, all innervated by the femoral nerve, all extend the knee joint through the patellar ligament. Extensors. Extensors are easy. Flexors. Flexors on the posterior compartment, everything on the back, innervated by the tibial nerve. Let's see if that holds up. Collectively, these ones are the hamstrings. There are four muscles here as well, at least four heads. The biceps femoris has a long head and a short head. They sit laterally. Semitendinosus and semimembranosus, two other muscles that sit more medially. Incidentally, the way that you remember tendinosus versus membranosus is tendinosus is always on top. Semitendinosus is on top. Semitendinosus is on top. Semimembranosus, semitendinosus, and the two heads of the biceps femoris. All cross the knee joint and flex the knee joint. Joint angles getting smaller, and they're innervated by the tibial nerve. The tibial nerve is just the continuation of the sciatic nerve. So you can see that large conduit that we've talked about a few times, the sciatic nerve. At some point down here, another nerve breaks off, and what's left is the tibial nerve. Notice how far down the leg it goes. Most posterior muscles are innervated by the tibial nerve. And the tibial nerve is just the continuation of the sciatic nerve. You can see it conveniently in this little diamond shape. This diamond shape is the popliteal fossa, which is another interesting landmark or interesting organization that we're going to talk about. So tibial nerve. Let's go back here just for a second. Tibial nerve is just the continuation of the sciatic nerve when this branch comes off. And that branch happens right at the opening of this diamond shape, right at the top of what's called the popliteal fossa. We'll come back to that in a second. I want to introduce the muscles of the lower leg first, and then we'll talk about the popliteal fossa in a bit more detail. The tibial nerve arises right here and innervates the muscles that flex the knee. Last couple of videos. Anterior and posterior compartments of the lower leg. The foreleg, if you will. Not the forearm, but the foreleg. And most of us, they look like this, but when you train as a German track cyclist, like Robert Forsterman, you can get some pretty nice definition on those muscles of the lower leg. Anterior group and posterior group. Not easily distinguishable as flexors or extensors. Because the ankle joint is slightly different in how it moves. So we don't call them extensors and flexors. Instead, we differentiate with how the foot moves in relation to the tibia. Either plantar flexors or dorsiflexors. So a dorsiflexor brings the top of the foot closer to the tibia, raises the toes upwards. Plantar flexion is pointing the toes down. Plantar flexion is pointing the toes down. Pointing the toes down. So muscles on the posterior aspect contract. Again, posterior aspect innervated by the tibial nerve. This is a common theme throughout this section. There's a little bit of a monkey wrench thrown into play because we've never seen the fibular nerve before. That is a brand new nerve. But it arises in the popliteal fossa, which is what we're going to talk about next. Also, just a brief connection. These are muscles involved in foot drop. I'll show you how this nerve specifically is susceptible to damage. And if it's damaged, if it's not sending signals properly, it results in a condition called foot drop, where you're unable to dorsiflex your foot. You can't lift your toes up, and they drag on the ground, and you're more likely to trip. It's actually fairly common in yoga, if you don't do yoga properly. So, posterior muscles that plantar flex the foot, gastrocnemius and soleus. Gastrocnemius has the two big heads and is most superficial. Soleus is the fairly large fan-shaped muscle underneath. If I fade gastrocnemius, you can see the extent of soleus underneath. Both of these work through the Achilles tendon, which I don't actually show you in the video, to plantar flex or point the toes. You can see that plantar flexion action here. You can see the Achilles tendon, though I don't point it out. Articulating the ankle, pointing the toes. Gastrocnemius and soleus. So being in the posterior compartment, you already know what nerve innervates these muscles. Tibial nerve. Tibial nerve continues through the popliteal fossa all the way down. So the same pathway that we've traced before, the sciatic nerve becomes the tibial nerve. The tibial nerve innervates the hamstrings and the muscles on the back of the calves, the gastrocnemius and the soleus muscle. Anything posteriorly innervated by the tibial nerve. And this is showing you the exact same thing. Now, I do show you the popliteal fossa in this video. The borders of the popliteal fossa are the membranosus muscles on the left, the biceps femoris muscles on the right, and then the heads of the gastrocnemius. So you can see a couple really important features in the popliteal fossa. Let me just pause it right here for a second. The sciatic nerve, as it reaches the top of this diamond, splits in two. The one nerve that we're concerned with is the tibial nerve that continues on through the lower leg. The nerve that splits off is the common fibular nerve. And it runs laterally through the popliteal fossa. Common fibular nerve. This is foreshadowing for the fibular nerve that we're going to talk about on the anterior portion of the leg. It's important to notice its path because as it moves laterally, it's very superficial. And being very superficial, it wraps around the head of the fibula. Here it goes. Around the head of the fibula, so damage to the fibula, breakage to the fibula, or just resting the outside of your leg improperly, stretching this too much, can damage that nerve. We'll see where that nerve goes in the next quick video. Notice also, there's an artery front and center within the popliteal fossa. The femoral artery becomes the popliteal artery. Femoral artery you can see continuing down the front of the leg. We acknowledged it in the femoral triangle already. It wraps around the back of the femur. And right in the middle of the popliteal fossa, it becomes the popliteal artery. So this diamond shape is really unique for a couple of reasons. It's where the sciatic nerve splits. You have the tibial and the common fibular nerve. And it's where the femoral artery becomes the popliteal artery and then delivers blood through the structures of the lower leg. A diamond shape is the popliteal fossa. Now I just want to quickly show you the muscles on the anterior surface. There's really only one that I want to point out. That dorsiflexes the foot, tibialis anterior. And really, I want to show this to you because of how it's innervated by the fibular nerve. So notice the path of tibialis anterior. It's on the front of the foot. It wraps around the foot in a slightly odd way, which means it has more actions than just dorsiflexion, but I'm only highlighting dorsiflexion for you here, bringing the dorsum, or the back of the foot, the top of the foot, towards the tibia. Dorsiflexion, innervated by a branch of that common fibular nerve, the deep branch of the common fibular nerve. There are deep and superficial branches. We're not going to look at the superficial branch, but this is the common fibular. As it wraps around the fibula, it gives rise to a deep branch that innervates the tibialis anterior. And so if there's ever a lesion or damage or something that stretches the nerve around the head of the fibula, it will affect tibialis anterior. And it also affects these muscles as well, which I'm not going to name for you, but you can read it on the slide if you want to. Those muscles also involved in dorsiflexion, keeping the toes of the foot up. And so if there's damage to the common fibular nerve, these muscles don't work as well. Collectively, the toes drop, condition known as foot drop. The reason that it happens in yoga is if you overflex the knee, and I forget the name of the posture, but where you're, I can't even describe it. But if the knee is overflexed and there's extra tension on the fibula as the nerve wraps around, it can pull that nerve, damaging the nerve and the signals that get sent through to the anterior compartment. So, a lot of videos. But I think that the animations do a really good job of helping you put together the picture as we move down through the leg. Rather than looking at static images like you're doing in the slides, being able to consult these animations online, I think, should be able to help orient you a little bit better. That said, we've covered a lot of information in this section. The lower limb, anchored to the axial skeleton by the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle made up of 3 bones, the 2 coxal bones, each made up of 1 ilium, 1 ischium, 1 pubis, and their associated interesting structures. The hip joint, where it connects to the pelvic girdle, is formed by the femur, articulating with the acetabulum, that really deep socket that's made of parts of all 3 of the coxal bones, or all 3 of the bones that make up each coxal bone. That really deep socket accepting the head of the femur, making the hip joint. High degree of movability, not nearly as high a range of motion as the shoulder joint. It's much more secure. There's some parallels as we go down through the lower leg. I'm not going to list all the details here. But notice a similar number of bones, 30 bones, in 4 locations instead of in 3 locations this time, because the patella is a new addition. The patella wasn't something that was, there's no analogy for the patella in the upper limb. So I won't list those structures exhaustively, although we did talk a fair bit about the femur itself. We mentioned the tibia and the fibula. We're not talking about the bones of the foot. And similarly, we're not talking about the intrinsic muscles of the foot, just the ones that we discussed today. Keep in mind that muscles in their respective compartments share innervation. So any muscle on the posterior side, your head, your mind automatically jumps to tibial nerve. And you'd probably be right. Knee flexors, plantar flexors, hip extensors innervated by the tibial nerve. Anterior compartment, mostly femoral nerve, with one exception in the lower leg, as we just discussed. They often share innervation and actions in each of those compartments. So when we come to class tomorrow, we'll start a new section on muscle tissue. We've talked forever about muscles contracting and shortening, articulating a joint, making a joint move, but why? How does a muscle shorten? What are the structures that do that? So we'll talk about that in depth tomorrow. Have a wonderful Thursday.